At the end of the personality lecture, I pointed that the situation sometimes has the power to make us behave in certain ways, and that's what social psychology is all about. So what we're doing when we're looking at social psychology is studying how people are influenced by others and the situation. So here I want you to think about the power of the situation to make us behave. Historically, social psychology has one of the most interesting starts as an area within psychology. This really got popular after World War II. Remember, of course, that after World War II, the world started to learn about the atrocities that had happened in Nazi Germany and that Hitler had coordinated the extermination of millions of people, Jews and gypsies and homosexuals, and the world was horrified that this could happen. And a lot of people started pointing the finger at the Germans and saying that there was something wrong with the German people, that something like this couldn't happen anywhere. Something like this wouldn't happen in the United States, for example. It could only happen in Germany. And that's because there was something wrong with the German people, that they somehow were evil. Now, a lot of psychologists, though, didn't necessarily buy that, in particular people who wanted to think about how the situation can make us behave in ways that we might not expect. And those were the early social psychologists. They thought that there might be some psychological principles at play that helped to explain how it was the case that so many seemingly normal average Joes in Germany could have helped coordinate and carry out this huge genocide. So the ideas that we'll talk about in this context are conformity and obedience and a little bit about social roles. So starting with conformity. Conformity is when we behave or think to fit in with a group standard. And this cartoon is funny, of course, because all these badass looking guys have shirts on that say nonconformist, thereby making them conformists. And a majority of the time when we call someone a conformist, we mean it as an insult. But really, 95% or so of the kind of conformity that we engage in are actually useful. So things like conforming to the fact that you should wear clothes, or conforming to stopping at stoplights. And most of those help this thing we call society work better. But there are times where conformity could be a problem, such as in the case where people conformed with the ideas of Nazi Germany. The original study here was done by a guy named Solomon Asch in the 50s, and he basically set up a very easy, simple study where he had a group of men sitting around a table, and he showed them the line on the left and asked them which of the lines on the right match this line on the left. And basically there's a bunch of guys sitting around, and this, let's say, is you. You've come to participate in this study. And they go around and ask, and the first guy says B, and the second guy says B, and the third guy says B, etc., until it gets to you, and then you say B, because it's clear that's the line that matches. But let's say now that we go around a few more times and come to this line again, and now the first guy says A, and the second guy says A, and the third guy says A, and then it's your turn. And what do you say? And that's what the study was really getting at. Little do you know that you're the only real participant in this study. All of the other men sitting around the table are what we refer to as confederates, who are people who have been hired by researchers to act in the study. And they're following a script, so they purposely gave the wrong answer. And what the study is meant to do is to see what you would do. What happened is that over a half the people said A, the clearly wrong answer. And the argument is because they were conforming to what the group was doing. Now you might be thinking this is kind of silly, and what does this have to do with Nazi Germany? Well, it is kind of silly, but even under this very laid back, low stakes situation, over half of people went along with the group. So you can imagine in a situation where, like Nazi Germany, where if you didn't follow or think along with what the rest of the country thought or the Nazi party thought, that you or your family could be killed or sent to a concentration camp. And there was very high stakes, so probably it was the case that even more people conformed under such high stakes. Then we have obedience, and obedience is really about following an authority figure. So conformity is following the group, obedience is following an authority figure. The classic experiment here was one done by Stanley Milgram in the 60s, and this is oftentimes referred to as the shock experiment. So here we have Stanley Milgram on the left and the shock apparatus on the right. And the way this worked is that you had two people. You had a learner and a teacher who would come into the experiment, and at the beginning they would flip a coin to randomly assign each to a group. But again, what you wouldn't know is that the learner was a confederate always. It was rigged so that the person who had come in pretending to be a participant but who was actually hired by the researcher always became the learner. You, or the person who would come in to be the real participant, would always end up being the teacher. And what they told you is the study was about punishment forms and how that could help or hinder learning. The goal was for you as the teacher to read a list of paired words like snow, turtle, sock, balloon, and the learner was supposed to try to memorize them as best they could. And then after going through the whole list, you'd go back and you'd say snow, and then the learner was supposed to tell you what the paired word was. In this case, it was turtle. If they got the answer correct, that was fine, you went to the next one, but if they got the answer wrong, you as the teacher were supposed to administer a shock from that shock machine. And the shock machine had lots of different buttons on it, starting at a low intensity of shock and moving up in 15-volt increments. So along the bottom there was also descriptors, talking with very mild shock and then turning to moderate shock and then painful shock. And at the very end, under the 450 volts, which was the last button on there, it said XXX, sort of implying that this was a dangerous, potentially deadly amount of shock. So each time the learner got one wrong, you were supposed to administer a shock, and the next time they got one wrong, you'd administer a shock again, but you'd go up and give them the next intensity of shock. So every time you administered a shock, it was a more extreme shock. Now the way that it was laid out is that there was a wall, and here the wall is differentiating between the pink background and the blue background. So the teacher is the person in the S position, and the experimenter, the E, is where Stanley Milgram would sit. He was the authority figure. And the learner, the Confederate in the study, was on the other side of a wall, hooked up to this machine in the position of A. So of course for the teacher it was important that they thought that the learner was actually getting shocked, but of course he actually wasn't. He just had a script where he would react as if he was getting shocked. So what Milgram wanted to know is how many people would have gone all the way up to 450 volts, the potentially deadly shock according to this machine. What percentage of the people would have said, no, I'm not doing this, obviously, and what percent would go all the way? Because as you got further and further into the intensity of the shock, and of course the learner was actually missing things on purpose so that you had an opportunity to give him that higher intensity of a shock, he started to complain about things like a heart condition and that it would hurt. And then at some point, he stops responding altogether. The implication being that something has happened, that potentially he's fallen ill or that he's dead. What they found is, looking at this chart, if you go all the way to the right and you see that XXX, 66% of people went all the way. This again is under circumstances where there's not a lot of pressure. If the participant wanted to stop, the teacher wanted to stop, Milgram, who was just sitting quietly in the corner, would say something like, the experiment must continue. Please go on. He never threatened them with force or violence. They knew that coming in that if they wanted to leave at any time, they would still get paid. So there was no real consequence for stopping. But simply having someone saying, please continue, in a very friendly tone, kept 3/4 of the people going all the way. Now again, going back to Nazi Germany, nobody was kind or not threatening when they tried to get you to do something. If you weren't going to follow through with what they asked, there were serious repercussions, such as death, like we talked about earlier, or being sent off to a camp. So both conformity and obedience help us to understand what happened in Nazi Germany. There's also another interesting idea that points to a very classic experiment called social roles. And the Stanford Prison Experiment is that classic experiment. So there is going to be a link after this lecture for you to watch this video about the Stanford Prison Experiment, and then we're going to talk about it in class. Please pay attention to the issues of what part of the behavior is related to the people's personalities and what part of the behavior C is related to the situation.